Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jae-Jae Spoon, and I'm a professor of political science and director of the Center for European Studies at Pitt. Welcome to the first conversation on Europe of the semester, which is the first in our series, Creating Europe Through, which is part of our Year of Creating Europe series. Each of these conversations will explore the creation of what Europe is, of Europeanness and European identity. Today's topic is Creating Europe Through Crisis. Other topics in the series include creating Europe through the built environment, multilingualism, and culture. Our roundtable today is co-organized and co-sponsored by the European Union Studies Association, and we are pleased to have several members of the EUSA Executive Committee joining us on today's panel. You will have the opportunity to ask questions using the chat or question and answer function. Feel free to post questions at any time during the discussion, and I will try to get to as many of these as I can. If you'd like to ask a question yourself, please use the raised hand feature when we get to the Q&A portion of the event, and I'd be happy to have you unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you would like. Today's conversation is sponsored by the European Studies Center and the University Center of International Studies at Pitt. It's co-funded by the Erasmus program of the European Union. Other co-sponsors are the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at Florida International University, the European Union Center at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Florida. To learn more about future conversations on Europe and programming with other EU-funded institutions in the US through our hashtag Jean Monnet in the USA initiative, visit our website, and one of my colleagues will put that in the chat. I want to thank Iris Matijevich and Kenny Riley for their help with today's event. Over the last 10 to 15 years, the European Union and its member states have experienced many different crises, from economic to immigration, terrorism, security, and now the pandemic. Each of these have had their own impact on the EU and Europe and have shaped what Europe is and is not. Europe, European identity, and Europeanness. To help us understand these crises and the impact they've had, I'm joined today by a panel of distinguished scholars who will talk about these various crises. To start, each of our panelists will provide some reflections on the various crises facing Europe. First, we have Matthias Matthijs, who will comment on Brexit and on the Eurozone crisis. Matthias is Associate Professor of International Political Economy at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies and Senior Fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Since May 2019, he is also the chair of the Executive Committee of the European Union Studies Association. He's the author of Ideas and Economic Crises in Britain and co-editor with Mark Blyth of The Future of the Euro. He has published numerous peer-reviewed articles in the field of comparative and international political economy, on the politics of economic ideas, and on European integration. He's currently working on a book-length project that delves into the fall and rise of national elite consensus around European integration in the last 15 years. Matthias?
Yes, thank you, JJ. Thanks for hosting all of us, and an honor and a pleasure to share the floor with so many great colleagues which span the Pacific through the Atlantic, from California to continental Europe. So it's almost impossible to talk about Brexit and the Eurozone crisis and the effects it had in just 5 minutes. So I think they are linked, and I do want to talk about 2020 specifically, and the last 12 months, maybe the last 15 months, and what has happened. I think maybe surprising to some of you who know my work, I'm going to take a surprisingly historical institutionalist take on this. It seems to me that certain events were key for the following sequencing and how things played out, and also how certain critical junctures and how fortuitous events played out led to a Europe, I think, being remarkably successful, and the project of European integration being remarkably successful in 2020. I think including many of us on the panel today we're actually pleasantly surprised by some of the things, especially when it comes to the EU dealing with Brexit as an entity, and bringing it to a relatively successful conclusion, similar with the strides forward in fiscal capacity on the Eurozone level that have happened in 2020. So quickly starting with Brexit, I mean, here the sequencing point that's key, I think, is a calculation or miscalculation on the part of the Scottish Nationalist Party and the Liberal Democrats to go for elections in that fateful fall of 2019, right? I mean, both for their own reasons, they decided to kind of align themselves with a very weak prime minister at the time, Boris Johnson, to bank on elections. The SNP, because they knew the Tories would win it and they would win it in Scotland. And the Lib Dems, I think, were banking on this kind of, excuse my French, bollocks to Brexit idea that they said, we're just going to ignore the second referendum altogether and just going to withdraw Article 50 and basically be done with Brexit altogether, forget the whole national nightmare. So of course we all know what happened, right? Boris Johnson did call an election, won a kind of a thumping victory, right? Destroyed the Red Wall in the north of England, and the rest was history, right? That set in place then that Brexit was going to become reality. People that said Brexit was never going to happen were completely, you know, taken off hand, if you want. And so by January 31, 2020, Britain had left the European Union, or the political institutions of the European Union. And I think what's striking that from then onwards, if you look at the Brexit negotiations from an EU point of view, is the remarkable, so I want to make just 3 quick points, right? Remarkable unity on the part of the EU. The 27 stuck together and basically delegated this whole thing to the Commission, and the Commission stuck with their mandates. That's number 1. So the Commission was strengthened. Number 2 is that you saw kind of EU really emerging as a sovereign entity, right? The figure of Michel Barnier he was representing Europe, Europe's interest. He wasn't a Frenchman. He wasn't a former French foreign minister or anything like this. And I think was remarkably successful in keeping Europe together. And then let's be honest, the deal that was struck on Christmas Eve that Boris Johnson hailed as this something, you know, a cakeist deal is a German deal. It's good for Germany. It has 0 tariffs and 0 quotas on trade in goods. And that's what surplus countries on exports want, right? So it's hard to see this being kind of a great coup for Great Britain, because what they would have needed is also services. And the fact that they're not included in the deal is actually also a bit of a victory for France in a way. So in the end, the deal, I think, was successful, and Europe, I think myself included, I was very worried, to be honest, when the Brexit vote happened, that this would lead to a much weaker European Union. So we haven't seen this. So again, this is a case of a Brexit crisis out of which Europe actually emerged quite strong. On the Eurozone part, and that's the second part of my comments today, is here it is linked to Brexit, because it is kind of a fortuitous event in a way that on January 31, the UK had left, right? And literally 6 weeks later, we're dealing with a kind of global pandemic that Europe then suddenly needs to respond to, but would no longer have to worry about the UK being a veto player on future steps on integration and so on. Another fortuitous, or kind of disastrous event, if you want, is that the countries that were hit the worst by COVID-19 in early March 2020, and Catherine de Vries will remember this well because she had just moved to Italy at the time, was Italy and Spain, and to some extent also France. So these were the countries that had been hit the hardest by austerity, by structural reform, that had cut back on their public health and so on. And so it's almost like the countries that were the weakest at the time in European integration were now hit by this crisis that was none of their own making, nothing of their own responsibility. And so I think that triggered something in the minds of Paris, Berlin, Northern European politicians, that something needed to be done on the solidarity front with Southern Europe, right? And so that was then amplified by the fact that Donald Trump's America was doing absolutely nothing to help Europe, where it was much worse early on, and that you had Chinese and Russian airplanes landing in Rome and Barcelona and helping out while the North was discussing export bans and so on. I think so Europe acted very quickly, and I think it was a kind of almost a Damascene conversion moment for Merkel, where she was like, okay, not only is this now, we need to talk about risk sharing much more than about risk reduction on the national level, but also other fortuitous event in 2017, coalition partner was now the SPD again, with a new finance minister, Scholz, who had brought in a lot of new, younger people who thought very differently about the future of the euro and risk sharing, right? So to me, the big story of COVID-19 for the Eurozone is this shift, this Franco-German proposal in May that was in close coordination with the Commission, that basically put this big new fancy budget on the table, right? A one-off Eurozone Eurobond issuance, 500 billion euro all in grants. That was clearly a redistributive element. And that, I mean, I share some of EU studies scholars' skepticism that this is maybe not the Hamiltonian moment many of us may dream about or think that the Eurozone needs, but yet the Rubicon, I think, in Berlin was crossed on this, right? So there remains, and let me end there because there's a lot of people and a lot of things that we want to discuss. There remains a big question on own resources, right? I'm very skeptical that the Commission will be able to levy its own taxes in the future. This is not something that countries want to give up that easily to Brussels, especially in member states. It's more the opposite direction, right? The regions want more taxing capabilities and more their own resources rather than giving them to Europe. And then secondly, I think Germany, as long as it remains an exporting country, will be very queasy about having an international role for the euro, because it will make the euro more attractive, which means it will appreciate and it will hit their export sector. But we can come back to that in the Q&A. So let me pass it back to you, Jae-Jae. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matthias, very much for those comments. Next, we have our Daniel Keleman, who will comment on challenges to the rule of law and democratic backsliding. Dan is professor of political science and law and Jean Monnet chair in European Union politics at Rutgers University. His research focuses on the interaction of law and politics in the EU. His 2011 book, Euro Legalism, The Transformation of Law and Regulation in the European Union, won the EUSA Best Book Award. He's the author or editor of 5 other books and author of over 100 articles and book chapters. Prior to Rutgers, Dan was fellow in politics, Lincoln College, University of Oxford. He's been a member of the Institute for Advanced Study, a fellow in the program in Law and Public Affairs at Princeton University, and a Fulbright Fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. He's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks very much, Jae-Jae. You all hear me fine? Great. Well, your first speaker, Professor Matthijs, knows that I've studied different EU crises for many years, and he used to joke, so whenever there's a crisis, I'd say, "Oh, this won't tear the EU apart. It'll lead to deepening." And he would always joke about how, as a sunny California optimist on everything to do with the EU. But in what I'm going to say now, you'll see my darker, maybe more pessimistic Hungarian heritage show through, because when it comes to the rule of law crisis, I think this isn't a crisis that's leading to deepening. It's a very problematic one. So first thing is, what is the rule of law crisis, which I've been asked to talk about? Well, actually, the first thing I'd say, in a way, even that term, even though that's the term people usually use, it's a bit of a euphemism. What we're really talking about here is an autocracy crisis. It's a crisis that involves the fact that the EU, which is supposed to be a community based on the rule of law, composed of democracies who respect rule of law norms, has allowed the emergence of authoritarian regimes that systematically flout those norms. Now, this kind of rule of law backsliding by these increasingly autocratic member governments, it's not just a problem for citizens of those states, although it is a problem for them, it's actually potentially an existential threat for the EU as a whole. Why? Because the operation of the EU depends on the sincere cooperation of its member states whose judiciaries and administrations respect rule of law norms. The EU has no coercive power, right? Really, it ultimately depends on its legal order. And when you have member governments, who flout those norms, they can't be relied on to implement EU law. This will inevitably affect citizens and businesses in other member states and undermine the legal order of the EU. And by the way, we just saw, the latest illustration of this yesterday, I guess, or New York Times articles about it today too, that Frontex, the EU borders agency, is pulled out of Hungary because the government is flouting EU law on migration policy with its pushbacks at the borders, ignoring ECJ judgments, et cetera. So as I've written, some of you may be familiar, I have this article last year in the Journal of European Public Policy that I think the EU is stuck in this, what I sometimes call an authoritarian equilibrium or an autocracy trap, where a combination of party politics among Euro parties protecting pet autocrats, along with kind of intergovernmental norms of deference, that factor together with the EU funding that finances these regimes, together with free movement or emigration within the single market that allows people who kind of are dissatisfied with these regimes to just move away, that those three factors allow these regimes to endure within the EU. So that's the nature of this crisis that I'm talking about. Well, so now I want to quickly kind of address the three questions that our host Professor Spoon put to us, and that is, how is this created, this rule of law crisis created, what Europe is today, how it's perceived, et cetera. Well, I guess the first thing, just to go back to my first point, a lot of the crises we talk about, we kind of ask, have they led to deepening? So that's something I've worked on with Eric Jones, Sophie Mounier, this concept of failing forward. Well, the EU is not failing forward through this crisis of rule of law to deeper integration. In fact, Tom Pavone and Cassie Emmons have a draft paper on that, where they make that point that it's not encouraging deepening. But what's happening instead, the rule of law crisis is encouraging a different Europe, a different EU, but a worse one than we've had before. Because these autocratic regimes, they don't just create problems at home. They're trying to infiltrate and reshape the EU, right? So the Orban regime, the Kaczynski regime, the other increasingly problematic regimes like the Borisov regime in Bulgaria, they're putting their people in EU institutions, in committees in the European Parliament, positions in the Commission, et cetera. And the crisis is spreading to other states. So we see a kind of a spread of this cancer of autocracy. So I think one way this has changed the perception is that, I don't know, you remember the 1990s, early 2000s, normative power Europe? Remember that literature? Well, that's a joke now, right? You can't be a normative power Europe when you have autocratic regimes. And so it's really affecting kind of how the EU is seen and externally as well. Okay, question 2. I have like 2 minutes left, JJ. I'm not too long, maybe one or two. Okay. So second question was, how have these crises influenced European identity, what it means to be European? I guess one identity related point I make is that the countries experiencing this backsliding are countries that have very strong support for EU membership, right? So a lot of people have sort of argue, oh, well, if the EU tries to intervene, crack down, they will turn the populations against Europe or something, or help these regimes. I've never bought that for a second. There's no evidence of that. I mean, just think about that the protesters who are trying to defend rule of law and democracy against these trends, they always wave EU flags in their protests. They're asking, Europe, help me. And the EU just keeps letting them down, okay? And then finally, what are the implications of these crises? Where do we go from here? We can talk more about that later, but as I said, I think the rot is spreading. It's an existential threat to the EU's legal order. And I don't think these issues will be resolved for the time being, really until the political enablers of these regimes, so let's say that the parties who protect them, like the European People's Party, the CDU in Germany, the parties that protect these regimes, until they start paying a political price for that, they're just going to keep enabling, kind of just the way Mitch McConnell enabled Trump and those forces. It'll keep happening in the EU unless they pay a political price. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Dan. Lots of really interesting things that we will come back to later as well. So next we have Sara Wallace Goodman, who will discuss immigration and citizenship. Sara is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, and the incoming chair of the Executive Committee of the EU Studies Association. Her research examines democratic citizenship and the shaping of political identity through immigrant integration. She's the author of Immigration and Membership Politics in Western Europe and co-author of the forthcoming Pandemic Politics, currently working on a book-length project on civic obligation during democratic backsliding. So lots of connections with some of our other speakers as well. Her work has also appeared in the Journal of Politics, World Politics, Comparative Political Studies, international organizations, and other venues. Welcome, Sara.
Thanks for having me, everyone. So I'm going to talk about immigration crisis, and the fun thing about Europe is there's more than one. So, there's the refugee crisis, so the influx of Syrian refugees peaking in about 2015. That's one. There's the critical consolidation of anti-immigrant attitudes in political parties and the durable policy dimension around which parties can be positioned. That's two. I'd say three, there's an ongoing intra-EU bias that exists between second and first country nationals when it comes to employment and social and political integration. So between North and South, East and West, right? So all of these show that immigration is really an immutable part of EU politics and European political life at this point. I want to make the argument today that they all represent a crisis of Europe, not necessarily for Europe. So thinking about the refugee crisis, or migration more generally. Europe can accommodate. It has before, it has space, it has money, right? But its political leaders in positions very much in line with public preferences take hard stances. Two recent examples come to mind. So Denmark recently issued a goal of 0 asylum seekers. Britain, remember them. So they are now offering incentives for EU citizens, even high-skilled, right, to repatriate to the continent. So it's not only lack of policy, though that certainly didn't help in the case of the refugee crisis, it's really a lack of political will that I'm going to focus on today, which I think answers like 2 of the 3 questions that JJ asked. It's lack of political will to both act, to participate in solidarity with other member states, and that I characterize as a problem of Europe. So I'm going to focus for the next couple of minutes on the refugee crisis, broad outlines of what happened and what sort of we have today, what we learned through crisis. So, how did the EU enter crisis, right? Well, it had a set of common rules, the Common European and Asylum System, which had directives that incorporated things that you may be familiar with, like the Dublin system, Eurodac, so fingerprinting. So it had these common rules, common standards, but it didn't have common practices, right? So an asylum seeker that was processed in a place like Greece would be different than in Germany. So reception varied widely, as an example. And when we think about kind of the 3 major descriptive aspects of the crisis, so sea crossing and the role of human smuggling, land crossing, so the Balkan Dam, and including the Turkey deal, and quotas, and making states share out asylum seekers. On all 3 of these dimensions, we see this critical lack of political will to act together. And in response to each of these sort of episodes or corners of the crisis, we didn't see in response a kind of shoring up of Dublin or a shoring up of EU policy. We saw, by and large, a renationalization of borders and responses. Why is that the case? Well, there's no silver bullet. I'm talking here about political will like a silver bullet, but we see this manifest in a number of responses. So there's this weakly integrated core, right? So there's a lot of research on the asylum policy that talks about the inherent statism that results when you have a weakly integrated policy core. So that's 1. 2 is the kind of the public nature of the crisis. Not only was policy happening in a public space, so there was this kind of performative aspect of responding to the public will, but it meant that elites could not make policy that was kind of shielded from this public dissensus. So it was a kind of a second reason. Third, like Germany couldn't do it by itself, right? It couldn't corral other members. It had kind of weaker bargaining powers compared to like the Eurozone crisis. Merkel faced contestation from within her own party, right? It was, imagine trying to corral other member states. And then in terms of what you saw from the EU is you really kind of, what could be characterized as this overreach. Brussels kind of overreached or overplayed its hand, right? So kind of pitted, the commission was battling with the council for prestige, and what you saw were these kind of administratively valid policies that were politically powerless, so quotas. And so all of those responses, right, that was kind of like a bunch of realpolitik, right? And what kind of policy learning takes place in that environment, right? What does the landscape look like today? If there were another crisis, I imagine that the response would look quite similar, because in places, in response to the crisis, you still have these patchworks. The patchwork responses are kind of still there, particularly when it comes to the external border security. This needs political and legal shoring, and we haven't really seen those steps yet. What we have seen is that inland member states now realize that their border starts way more south, right, than previously thought. Dublin remains ill-equipped for shocks and still needs adjustments, right? So unlike the Eurozone crisis, the refugee crisis didn't produce this high level of political integration, neither vertically nor horizontally, nor by sector. It's certainly not this motor of closer or deeper integration. The good news, I always like to try and throw something in there, is it didn't lead to collapse of Schengen. or permanent reintroduction of border controls. But it did lead to the erosion of vertical authority, right? So it was Merkel, not the Commission, that negotiated with Turkey. The court, the ECJ found a number of member states in violation of relocation quotas, but to no effect. And as Dan mentioned, right, even if there is policy deepening, so you did have significant investments in Frontex or, the Coast Guard, right? Things are really stymied in practice by tolerance for authoritarianism. So I don't know how you operate in that kind of environment where, how do you continue working on the EU Pact of Migration and Asylum when you have authoritarian tolerance in the very places that you'll need to practice it? So, I said I'd like to try and include like a positive note, but that's a pretty big bummer there. But the refugee crisis is not a case where you see political integration result in response. And I think that is a crisis for Europe in thinking about solidarity and what political will looks like moving forward. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and for trying to put in something positive to the to the story. Great, and again, lots of connections and lots of things that we'll circle back to later in the conversation. Next, I'd like to welcome Stephanie Hoffman, who will focus on security issues. Stephanie is Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. Her research revolves around issues in international security, international organization, and regime complexity, the interlinkages between global and regional understandings of order, European and transatlantic security, as well as national foreign policy preference formation. When conducting her research, Stephanie draws on many different theoretical insights across disciplines and spends time in the field. Her work has been published with Cambridge University Press and in journals such as the European Journal of International Relations, International Affairs, Journal of Conflict Resolution, and the Journal of European Public Policy, among others. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, JJ, and welcome to Geneva at night. So as Sarah, I will go through a few crises, but I wanted to start with the conventional wisdom when we think about security. Because in security studies, the conventional wisdom basically says that violent conflict or war or the threat thereof, and let's be very scientific, let's call them big crises, can lead to the creation of alliances and military cooperation and integration. Research has shown that if these alliances are made out of democratic states, we can expect that these commitments will be credible over time. So now in Europe, there was already an alliance when the EU finally ventured into security policy at the end of the 1990s, namely NATO. And so the Common Security and Defense Policy, or CSDP, is not necessarily a response to external crisis per se, at least one of the magnitude of war, as NATO could take care of it. Some argue that the wars in the Balkans were a trigger for the creation of CSDP. And I am not going to deny that this has also contributed to the idea of finally pushing for this institution. But if we, for example, look at the example of the UK really being in the end of the 1990s, one of the driving forces behind CSDP, it was not as much the Balkans and the Balkan experience, but Tony Blair who drove the process, because the Tories actually thought that NATO and UN could take care of what was going on in the Balkans at the time. So in other words, domestic politics always has been a driving force of European security policy. And by the way, just as a footnote, when NATO was still more of a treaty than an organization, so in the beginning of the 50s, the European Cold and Steel community actually wanted to create what was called then the European Defense Community. And this mainly failed actually because of a domestic political crisis in France. So just to say, I will focus on quite a few crises. So domestic politics and different preferences, as Sarah also pointed out, play quite a big role in European security. And according to me, the biggest permanent crisis or challenge of European security policy really is and remains the lack of political will among European member states. European member states face different geopolitical threat perceptions, uncertainties, and are embedded in differently militarized political cultures. So that's not really, one could say, the best precondition to invest in very costly military hardware and integrate EU structures further. So while there's many different substantive crises, some of which I will just come in a second, I think that given different sensibilities across EU member states and different approaches to security, many member states experience crisis in very different ways, if they all agree that they're actually going through a crisis at the same time. So this particular institutional political crisis influences others as, for example, transatlantic tensions. So that's nothing new to Europe or the EU, by the way. I mean, Trump didn't invent them, but because already several times, European governments actually doubted the bonds that bind them to the US. But the Trump administration was most likely the biggest threat to transatlantic relations, as Trump openly doubted the purpose of NATO. The New York Times at the time reported that Trump really discussed several times that he wanted to withdraw from the alliance. However, not even this most recent crisis in transatlantic relations was felt equally acute by all European NATO members. The Hungarian and Polish governments, for example, have engaged in closer relations with Trump, while the French and the Germans took their distance. So what did this crisis lead to? Well, this crisis has given new life to a French discourse that existed for many years, the one on strategic autonomy, or the German government prefers the term strategic sovereignty. And strategic autonomy is now a term that's used on the EU level. It provides a platform based on which common security and defense concerns can be discussed with some more urgency. And it also inspires the strategic compass, which aims to specify how the overarching priorities defined by the EU global strategy can be implemented and which capabilities the EU should provide. And to a certain degree, we can say that it might have also contributed not only to increasing the discourse, but also the activity of increasing military spending in some of the EU member states. A third crisis is more external to the EU. A rising China and a muscle flexing Russia are challenging the US-sponsored liberal order, also in Europe. However, if we look at Russia's muscle flexing, it is a crisis for some in the EU, but not for all. Scholars such as Professor Keleman, for example, have shown that some of the EU member states have close relationships to Moscow. The Hungarian government, for example, as he calls it, serves like a Trojan horse for Russian influence in Europe, while Baltic states see themselves threatened by Russia. The German government, who might be decisive here, cares a lot about its foreign direct investment in China, but also in Hungary and Poland, by the way, and energy supplies coming from Russia. So it's very difficult for the EU to take a resolute and united stance on issues involving China and Russia. But I mean, this external challenge or crisis has led to more geopolitical language within the European Union. So von der Leyen and Borrell, the High Representative, actually make use of geopolitics now and a geopolitical commission in their speeches. And it has led to, admittedly, weak instruments maybe, such as new FDI screening regulations. One more crisis that Matthias already has mentioned is Brexit. And that has also implications for European security. I mean, after all, the UK is the strongest and most capable military in Europe next to France, and it leaving the EU really has, one could think or argue, reduced EU power, also taken away expertise, and also credibility in the field. But however, one should not forget that the UK under the Tories was also the biggest break in the development of the common security and defense policy. It was blocking several initiatives as it disagreed with an increase in the European Defense Agency's budget, vetoed the creation of an EU military headquarters, or was against the permanent structured cooperation as set out in the Lisbon Treaty. So now Brexit means that the UK no longer can shape EU security policy from within. So the EU has increased the European Defense Agency's budget, created an admittedly small military headquarters, has launched the permanent structured cooperation, established a European Defense Fund, and increased consultation and review mechanisms. PESCO is one good example, I think. I mean, it was launched right after Brexit was announced. But here again, I mean, so while institutionally it has pushed, this Brexit crisis has pushed into more institutional mechanisms, there is some dissatisfaction because, for example, France wanted a very inclusive PESCO, permanent structured cooperation, where capable militaries could cooperate on new initiatives. Germany, on the other hand, wanted an inclusive permanent structure. In the end, it became inclusive. Only Malta and Denmark are not part of it. But at least in recent interviews I've conducted with a team of Volkswagen Stiftung research grant holders, we have really found out that policymakers think it's a feel-good initiative, but not very much guided by strategic thinking. More impressive might be the European Defense Fund and the new DG that was created, defense industry and space. I mean, the European Defense Fund is within the European Commission, has around 8 billion euros, and it's now a permanent feature of the European Commission's budget. So it creates financial incentives for cooperative armaments programs. And last but not least, because I'm pretty sure my time is running out, and Catherine will talk about the pandemic much more, but we could also think of COVID being yet another crisis, because it has the potential of the reduction of defense spending, as has already been seen with the European Defense Fund that was actually first announced as a 13 billion investment and now is around 7 to 8 billion euros.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for your comments. Last but certainly not least, we have Catherine de Vries, who's joining us from Milan. So we have spanned California to Italy with our panelists. Catherine will discuss the pandemic crisis, as has been mentioned. Catherine is a Dean of Diversity and Inclusion and Professor of Political Science at Bocconi University in Milan, as I mentioned. She's also an affiliated professor at the Free University, Amsterdam, and associate member of Nuffield College in Oxford. Catherine is the author of 3 books, including Euroscepticism and the Future of European Integration, which received the European Union Studies Association Best Book Award and was selected by the Financial Times in its top 5 books to read about Europe's future. In her research, Catherine examines some of Europe's key challenges, such as Euroscepticism and political fragmentation. In her most recent research, funded through the European Research Council, she examines the conditions under which economic hardship affects support for socially conservative political agendas. Welcome, Catherine.
Hi, thank you for being there, and thanks also to everyone else. I really enjoyed all the presentations. I have the feeling that I kind of caught the short stick here, so to talk about the pandemic while we're in the middle of the pandemic is a little bit difficult, but I'll try to do it by kind of metaphors. So it was already a bit discussed, I think, in Dan's comments towards Matthias about the idea of kind of deepening and crisis, leading to deepening in the EU. It's kind of a traditional idea of the bicycle theory of European integration, right? We have to be moving forward, otherwise we fall over. As a Dutch woman, bicycle theory seemed very appropriate, but I wanted to use kind of 3 different metaphors that really also relate to means of transport to kind of think about how we could think about the pandemic. And I'm just doing that because, it's also a bit of a crystal ball. So I'm going to make 3 points. The pandemic as a roller coaster, the pandemic as a bump car, and the pandemic as a carousel. So I'm going to try to elaborate those 3 points. So first, the pandemic is a roller coaster. And I think that's what we kind of can say already, in the sense that it's just been an up and down to try to think about what this means for European integration. The way that Matthias was describing, many of us meet sometimes organized by Professor Keleman, who kind of organized talks about the EU. And it was like positive, negative, this is bad for Europe, this is positive for Europe. It was really kind of an ongoing element. It also really developed my own kind of mood during the entire pandemic, being in lockdown. You go from borders closed to Italy being totally isolated or feeling isolated from the EU, to tensions in a Eurogroup meeting where the Dutch finance minister said, quite explicit things to his Italian, Spanish and Portuguese counterparts, to then Macron in an FT interview saying that, the coronavirus could be the breakup of the EU, to then the Rubicon and the Recovery Fund, right? A lot of stuff in a very short time period. And now, vaccines, competition with the UK, Brexit, there's a lot of things going on. It's very difficult to know where we're going. So in that way, a roller coaster, right? It's up and down. It's very difficult to really navigate that. And to really say what it will mean. But what we do know, it's a stress test, like it's a stress test for any other political system. And I think what I want to say is that a lot of the things that we talked about, if we think about it in a comparative perspective, the EU is like any other polity. We're discussing the future of the US, we're discussing the future of India, we're discussing, the future of Russia, we're discussing the future of China. So it's no different on the European continent. And we're discussing for the Brits, the future and the unity of the UK. So in that way, it's, a polity and authority that's in a roller coaster, because a lot of what we're dealing with at the moment is very uncertain. So then the second, the pandemic is a bumper car. And I think a lot of you already talked about it, especially also Dan, in the sense that this crisis indeed has, led, at least on the economic side, to more than we could expect, and some other elements maybe less so, as security, on rule of law, and on immigration, which we've already talked about. But I think in a crisis, it's also very clear that there are rifts, right? And you see these bumper cars going at each other in kind of summit meetings, right? And I think it's very clearly been East and West on rule of law, but as Dan has already outlined, we've seen this one coming. This was going on for a long time, but I share very much the pessimism towards this, because the EU is ultimately a legal order. So if the legal order crumbles, this might have real ramifications. And we're going to see there has been a rule of law mechanism. It's not clear when it's going to be really implemented. There's a lot of discussion around this, but this is one big rift. But the other rift, and that makes it really difficult if you think about, optimizing models or game theoretic, 2 dimensions are really difficult to find some equilibrium, and that's the North-South, and that's on debt sharing. And yes, there is this recovery fund, but I can tell you that many political parties in Dutch parliament think this is temporary. But then if I look at it from an economics hat and from a kind of a hat of someone thinking about investing, we're borrowing with own resources. We're borrowing around the size of Spain on the international market. Taking out the size of Spain, and recovering it and moving out of this recovery fund, you can't do that overnight. So it's definitely going to be medium. It's probably going to be long term. And we saw that already this week. Some of you maybe who read the Financial Times, Schäuble going out like, this is not enough. Especially the period of the recovery fund is very short, and it's unclear if countries like Spain and Italy that have already an issue with what we call an absorption rate, so the extent to which they get funding of the EU, they're actually unable to use that fully because of bureaucratic problems. Now the timeline is even shorter than it is on structural funds, right? So the other money that gets given regularly in the EU element. So, these rifts are there. These rifts are going to come to the fore again. Then the third kind of means of transport means of transport is we're more like in Disneyland or something, but anyway, is the pandemic as a carousel. And the pandemic as a carousel is, really important from my perspective when we think about, how the EU, how basically the political and the politicization of the EU as an issue will develop. So what's really important to remember is because of because of the way that we've been couching basically and safeguarding the real economic fallout in many member states, the real economic crisis is going to begin. It's not like the US where we've seen this huge spike in unemployment. No, we haven't seen that because it's been subsidized by European countries for a very long time. We've seen that the Stability and Growth Pact and the state aid rules have been suspended, and that has led to real inequality between member states, right? So my prediction would be, even though I don't want to do it, but I'm going to do it anyway, we're going to go back to good old populist versus mainstream in no time, right? If we're back into kind of economic ideas, and if the EU is good for us, we've seen kind of this populism or this maybe extreme right, far left, far right critique of the EU mellowing down because the EU was able to kind of act in some ways fairly quickly, and Brexit also put a damper on that kind of Euroscepticism, but I'm pretty sure it's going to come back because political entrepreneurs always want to politicize something, and the EU is a perfect thing to politicize, because if you want to show yourself that you're anti-mainstream, well, what you need to be is anti-European, right? So in that way, I think that, we're going to see, in terms of the carousel, we're going to see this turning around again in very similar ways that we saw before. What does that mean for the future of Europe? That's kind of also a little bit the last question that Jae-Jae posed. Jae-Jae, I don't know. It's too difficult to say, but I do want to just highlight that the pandemic has, has not probably led to this kind of bicycle deepening as of yet, but it's difficult to know in the carousel where we're going. What is very clear is that we see these rifts, and these rifts have become stronger and more clear in the pandemic. And my kind of prediction will be that we're going to turn around and see some of the very same themes that we saw in the last decade come around in this decade. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Catherine. And thank you for the Disneyland analogies. I've been thinking about roller coasters and carousels, which would be much more fun means of transportation than the usual. But thank you so much to all of you. There's obviously so many interesting points that you've all made and really interesting connections between many of your comments. We're already starting to get a few questions, but as our audience members are, I think, thinking through everything that you all mentioned, and please put in your questions in the Q&A and in the chat, or raise your hand. I will pose one of the questions that I sent to all of you, and some of you did touch on this, but just to kind of perhaps offer some more reflection specifically on this as we gather some further questions, and that is more specifically thinking about this idea of European identity. And that is, again, as I prefaced in my emails to you, and as of course in the introduction to today's talk, that this really is, that this panel today is part of our this series of really thinking about sort of what Europe is and creating Europe and all of that, and how that connects to what it means to be European and European identity, and how that may vary cross-nationally, depending on where you're sitting, whether you're in France or the Netherlands or Poland. Over time, obviously, there's been just so many moving pieces and parts. And as I said, some of you have touched on this in your comments, but I thought we could do a round of getting some specific thoughts on this as we collect some other questions. So just so that we're not all talking over each other, actually, I'll take a volunteer to go first, and then just call on you as I see you on my screen. So does anyone want to jump into that first, or I can just pick one of you? Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
Happy to jump in. I'm going to jump in by citing Matthias, who's up. It's like the Brady Bunch. He's up there. Right. So Sylvia Merler and Matthias have this article to talk about these differences in North identity versus South identity in response to the Eurozone crisis. Right. And, when we think about what factors could encourage a kind of European identity, right? It's not going to be sort of these kinds of crises that, as everyone has talked about, that have kind of deepened the rifts between, right? And I think specifically about Brexit, right? So it's always useful to have, social identity theory, right? You need sort of a useful scapegoat. And when you take that out, right? So now, right, who's the scapegoat? Right? And I think that migration always serves as a kind of useful, it plays a useful outside role. I think that we're going to see, so COVID has really shut down new migration, but I think you're going to see, with uneven access to vaccines and with the economic recovery as a driver of new migration, you're going to see it sort of popping up again in national politics in a way that could create serious rifts, not just in terms of national political communities, but in terms of fomenting EU identity.
Great, thank you. Matthias.
Yeah, just quickly following up to what Sarah was saying. So that JCMS paper published about a year ago, what struck Sylvia and I in some of the data, right, is that we still think of kind of like young people as all being pro-EU, and there's a kind of dangerous shift there that northern EU member states, the young people, especially the less educated ones, see the EU where a lot of crises are coming from, right? It hit me as I was working with my research assistant, who's German, on this paper, and who's Christina Tanshoff, who's doing a PhD at Stanford now. And I was kind of, discussing this with her, and it made me realize I was 20 years older than her, about that. She was like, yeah, but when were you growing up? Like in the 90s or the 80s? Yeah, that's when Europe was great, right? Of course, there were no there was so many things happening. And she's like, but yeah, if you were, 10 years old during the global financial crisis like I was, and then kind of been through the last decade with all these crises, you think about this very differently. Even my friends in Germany who are, social democrats and kind of well-educated and so on. While at the same time, I think in Southern Europe, they really see Europe as almost kind of an escape valve, right? Where there is the future, and especially if you're in Southern Italy or Southern Spain and so on. So I think that's something that the last 10 years have radically shifted, and I think many of us have to kind of come to terms with. But I'm stepping on Catherine's domain here, so I don't want to talk too much about this.
Actually, Dan, I know wants to comment, so let me turn to him.
Yeah, just a quick thought on all that, and Yeah, again, I'm not the public opinion expert here. Catherine can talk more about that, but just picking up on the last points, I think there's something that I've written a little about that's really been hitting me throughout this, is the kind of contrast where the EU has been willing to intervene very sort of aggressively in internal affairs of southern states to impose austerity, and that's kind of what Matthias is getting on and shaping the identity and feelings of young people, especially in the South toward the EU. Whereas on the issues I was talking about, let's say rule of law, there's been, by contrast, this marked reluctance to get involved, right? And what you hear again and again is this refrain, oh, that's sensitive domestic political issues, et cetera. And so I think, when you think of, across these crises, the different ones we've been addressing, where the EU chooses to step in and use the powers it has, and where it doesn't, can really have a big impact on shaping identity in the long term. And I think just in terms of the COVID response, I think, as Catherine said, it's too early to see, because it has been, as you said, this roller coaster where sometimes it looks like, oh, this could pan out well for the EU's reputation and feeling about the EU, and then you have episodes where it looks like it's going to be a disaster. So I think we can't judge yet.
Unmute myself. Thanks, Dan. Stephanie.
Just very briefly, when looking at security, I think there was never really a strong European security identity, either on the political or the public opinion level. Security was often thought much more in transatlantic terms. So if there was an identity, I think the political community was more transatlantic than European, if I can simplify what Europe is right now. And in a way, that transatlantic element was also like the US, the leader in Europe, in a way, reacting and interpreting substantive crises with having the US leadership in mind. And so I think there's a potential here that this can change right now, right? I mean, Trump's election and the potential that somebody like him could be re-elected, for example, or like disagreements on China might actually lead to a more options to think European. But I'm not sure that every European member state, as I indicated, will think the same way about what European means. And I think we can see the same thing on the public level, because I mean, Eurobarometer has always shown like European security is actually pretty popular, but the moment you ask people to invest in European security, it becomes not very popular anymore. You don't want to spend much. And so that feeds into this kind of political crisis, so to speak, because there's not much money behind European security. And a recent poll actually by, I think, the European Council on Foreign Relations has shown that, so we think about, like the public thinks about it, but doesn't care that much about it. But it also now thinks the US is less reliable. It wants to be neutral towards China and Russia. So again, like the US is not so existential anymore on the elite level maybe, and on the public level. And that actually opens up to more politicization, actually, to think Europe differently in the security realm.
Yeah, I think kind of piggyback on that point of Stephanie. So I think it's too early to say, right, JJ, what's going to happen. But I think in one element, what I find very interesting, and what I notice also being in Europe through this, is that there is a sense among people that there is a European model of doing things. There might be variations, but like it's not brittled capitalism of the United States, just to make it very, charge it a little, or state-led capitalism of China, and that Europe is somewhere in between. Does that mean that everybody feels European and EU? No. So there's a little bit of a difference between, but I have the feeling that people do feel more European in a sense, but I don't want to always link that to the EU, right? But have the idea that they're distinct a little bit. And then I think that has to do with the experience of the United States. And what Dan was saying about, the moral power breaking in the EU, well, that moral power of the United States has broken, right? For many members. So there's a crisis in many other. So then the question is, okay, if the alternatives look bad, oh, maybe I'll just, associate myself. It's easier than with what I have. And then nonetheless, I think there's still this idea among Europeans that, okay, the EU is really difficult and really a difficult thing, but ultimately it will pull through. If that's true or not is a different story, right? But that's, I think, still this kind of idea. So it is this kind of ultimate anchor at the end of things. And in many countries, that is also to do. And I think that interestingly, you know, because the crisis is not clear, like the image of the Netherlands, for example, which is always this, oh, pure, we are so perfectly organized. Well, that's been shifted in the pandemic, right? So, you know, it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. But I think that the way that people view this now is also less certain because of what Sara was saying, that these, you know, the immigration, these traditional issues that populists pick up on and where they can like hit the EU with, look, you know, this is Schengen, you allow all these people to move freely, et cetera, those quote unquote normal issues are not in the arena. And I think as soon as that gets back, you get really in this cosmopolitan parochial mindset where the EU comes part of this politicization. So the question is a little bit how that will, you know, and if you then think about the carousel metaphor that I use, then, you know, we could be back there. But I do have the feeling that this idea of blocks, and that you have to be, you know, in line with the bloc has also sunk in. The same as that the Brits can say Brexit is over, but this is a never-ending Brexit where we're going to be in continuous negotiation, the same way that the EU is with Switzerland, right? So in that way, it's just like, how close are you to that EU? And I think that it's important to make the difference between European and EU. Many countries here have some relationship with, quote unquote, the hegemon, the EU. How exactly? You know, that's a different story. So I think that we, you know, Kate McNamara in another thing that we organized was kind of thing, we need to think this much more as a form of, you know, as a kind of form of authority, and how that authority gets in, you know, which you would think of empires, which you think of different kind of categories. And I think in that way, many Europeans would probably think that they you know, that they share that with other Europeans, even though they might not be super enthusiastic about the EU, right? And I think those are two different things.
I keep doing that, muting myself, unmuting myself, as we all do. This is, you know, we just all need a t-shirt or a hat that says this. But no, I think these are, you know, sort of all, you know, good points. And this idea of distinguishing between the EU and European, right? And I think that's often sort of something that we kind of lump together, and that's important. I think the other point that several of you kind of mentioned, which I think is sort of defining who you are by who you're not. Right, in terms of, right, and so the US, of course, has always been this, at least, you know, recently, right, defining, right, sort of the, not necessarily the sense of perhaps European, and that some of these, you know, crises that we've been talking about have created this sense of Europeanness, but it's in reference to what we aren't, right? So it's sort of that negative association, which I think is interesting. It kind of came up a few times in comments that you all raised. So we have many questions, so I want to give some time to these. So I will, and some of them are quite long. So I will do my best to summarize some of the points. And then whoever, a few of them are directed to a specific person, so I will direct them that way. But others who are more broad, so whoever wants to jump in, just wave your finger. Okay, so our first question is from Mark Pollock. But just as a general theme, everyone has complimented you all on your comments and the panel, so I will just make that covering comment from many of those in the audience. So he says that he wants to hit on the question about what we think about the direction of integration or stable constitutional compromise. What's striking to me is that the median response from everyone on the panel is that the EU has managed most, perhaps not all, crises with not much failing forward other than the budget, and without much evidence of disintegration, except maybe on rule of law. So he says, I can hear Andy Moravchik saying, quote, the constitutional order is pretty stable, unquote, dealing with crises with no big changes in integration. Is that right? And if not, what can we say big picture about the direction and mechanisms of integration or disintegration today? So whoever, Matthias, and then Dan. And then Keleman.
Sorry, let me unmute. Yeah,
and I'll remute.
An excellent question from Mark Polak. Thanks for that. Yeah, I'm not going to remind everybody that Andy Moravchik thought that Brexit was never going to happen. I guess I have now. But I do kind of look at.
I wasn't going to say that. But
I do look at the last decade of crises a little bit like the 1970s in European integration, right? So to me, there's many crises and some lead to big moves forward and others don't, right? And I think it's only in the last few years that I think elite views, national elite views, especially in Germany and France, but others as well, Italy, have come together around this view of European sovereignty. And I think it's clever. I don't know if you remember Nicolas Japko's book, Playing the Market, but in the 80s, the Commission very cleverly kind of got people to interpret different things around the market that was appealing. I think EU sovereignty could play that role in many ways, right? Is that there's more risk sharing. And to Catherine's point, we're not China, we're not the US, right? We have a European way, and there is geopolitical competition that's back, especially after 4 years of Trump and with a kind of much more aggressive China and even with Russia. So I actually think that, I'm not saying that the 2020s are going to look like the mid 80s to the mid 90s, because of course history never repeats, but I do see a kind of emerging consensus about some of the things that the EU and EU level can do, and some of the things that I think need to be much more back at the national level. That said, I mean, I share Dan's worry about rule of law and authoritarian resurgence.
Thanks, Matthias. Dan.
Yeah, hi, Mark. Thanks for the question. I don't think it would be right to say that, that Moravcik was right about the stability of the constitutional compromise. I think, kind of as Matthias is saying, there's movement in both directions on different issues. So, but I don't think that constitutes or that we should view that as a kind of stable equilibrium. I mean, first, just on the Eurozone stuff, even before the recovery package and the issuance of the common debt, which is a big step forward, even if we just go back further in the Eurozone crisis, right? Just the centralization of regulation over banking and the new powers for the ECB. This is there was such a move forward in integration on EMU in the past decade, like we couldn't have imagined it before. So first, just on that issue alone, I think that's enough movement to say it's different. And then, I don't know, I'd want to hear more from Sara on this, but despite the fact there have been big problems on immigration and some kind of falling apart and some policies which didn't deliver, I mean, the EU just hired 10,000 they're in the process of rolling it out over years, but they started hiring border guards for this new force. These people have uniforms. Now, they have to have, I guess, approval from the host state where they are before they can use any force. But, that's still a pretty big step forward if you take the long-term time horizon view and say things are moving, I think.
Great, Catherine.
Yeah, just on, I mean, I totally agree with what was said before. I think also on the thing of it being stable, and I'm not going to criticize Andrew Moravcik with the way that we often criticize him, which is the fact that he just doesn't have a big idea of politicization of other groups than producer and consumer groups. And what's really changed is that the constitutional order, not only that it's moved forward, but that constitutional order in and of itself has become part and parcel of domestic politics, of party play, of autocrats in Hungary, of radical right and radical left parties in the Netherlands and France and Italy and so on. So in that way, there is, it's the room to maneuver is much smaller for the EU in that way. So yes, we see these pushes, which are often, Chris Bickerton would kind of call it technocracy through the back door, right? That we use it like that. And then on the other hand, you have that politicization. And why do you get these pushes of democracy through the back door? Because of the politicization, because you can't do it over treaties. But that means also that the constitutional order gets challenged also in the way that, people are saying in Dutch parliament or in German parliament, hey, we need to have more rules to underline with what the ECB is doing. But they can't do that because they don't want to have any treaties, right? So it really is a very different story than before. And the last thing, very shortly on that. So I think there's been a fundamental change, and the fundamental change is potentially that's unstable is that Article 50 has been triggered and used, and there is actually now an off-the-shelf model to leave. Is it a good model to leave? Well, if you ask me from an economic efficiency point of view, no. But is there a model? Yes. And the way that I've always talked about this will be used as a way to benchmark what the EU is doing for many times, which will have implications for the politicization that I talked about. So no, I don't think that this is a form of, great question, Mark, by the way, but I don't think that in this way I would follow this idea that it's just been stable for next to the reasons that were already talked about before.
Thank you, Catherine. Stephanie.
Just very briefly, I mean, I actually think there is a little bit of failing forward in European security, but it's the failing forward in especially ambition and rhetoric, right? I mean, so this geopolitical language, for example, and strategic compass, all of this, I mean, it's all in the making. We don't know exactly where it leads to in terms of capabilities and structures, but a language has been introduced to the European Union, and that to me, like, is based also on certain crises, internal and external, and the EU fails forward very piecemeal, like in a direction of doing more within the EU. And something though that I didn't talk about, and that might actually be able to challenge the constitutional order nonetheless, is that because there's a lack of political will among the 27, what we see is like there are lots of minilateral or smaller initiatives, like Macron's European Intervention Initiative is quite a good example where he like unites the able and the capable, right? And he wants to actually create a platform based on which interventions can be launched. And so we have a few of those kind of minilateral agreements around the EU that might strengthen the EU, but might not, right? I mean, they haven't been used much yet or not at all. So just to say that also next to what's going on within the EU, at least like the lack of political will among 27 has led to like smaller coalitions of the willing that go beyond ad hoc institutions and have formalized some kind of meetings that exist in parallel now. And where exactly that's going to go, I don't know.
We have a question specifically to Sara, so I will also ask you the question, but also if you want to respond to sort of Dan's question, feel free to do that as well. So this question is from Amy Verdun, who wanted to have you sort of speculate a little bit about your vision for how to solve the migration issues in Europe and in the EU in 2 minutes or less. Given all your points in the analysis, is it something you think Europe should be taking more leadership on? So you might take that piece up. So.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And thank you for the provocation, Dan, because I think it actually makes the point. Right. So where do we see Europe spending its money on the question of migration? And it's in securitization. And that's not surprising. When we think back to the refugee crisis and where these patchwork solutions were, it was, sending EU money to, reception centers in Greece, but they weren't sending money for food. They were sending money for security, better cameras, better fingerprinting machines, training people to do those things. And so I think, when I'm solving the refugee crisis or migration policy in Europe, and casually on a Thursday, I think about this point, someone referenced Kate McNamara earlier, right? When we question about the political authority that the EU has, right? And we sort of have to think for a moment what the moral framework is behind the decisions that they make, right? Is its purpose to regulate or to govern? And I think in light of sort of the authoritarian intolerance that we see, that we should be hesitant about some of the moral authority that we assume can precede kind of functional migration policy, right? So I don't see that right now as a kind of a viable path forward, right? What's the moral framework driving current migration policy? It's securitization. So like what we saw is that the Commission tried and failed, and during the refugee crisis, right? And when it tries, I don't want to say that's worse, but it emboldens actors of bad faith when that happens, when you can't, implement the policies that you make for in this case, burden sharing. And so the prior question is, what would the moral framework be for migration policy to be enacted in the EU? And I don't think that the prospects there's no consensus there, I think, for a framework.
I keep muting myself so that you don't hear any background noise, and then I keep talking when I'm same story. So mostly you don't want to hear my dog in the background, which is what you would hear. Howling, yes, there's yours. And mine's been excommunicated because he often howls, literally, in the middle of things. Okay, so Dan, we have several questions for you, and so I will start with one of them, and some of them touch on the same thing. So the first one here is from Ron Linden, and so he says, you're certainly correct that the challenges of autocratic government in Hungary and Poland and others is an existential threat to the EU. But on the staffing issue, a new study by the European Democracy Fund found that new CEE members that are severely underrepresented in positions in EU institutions and in weaker agencies. Is there evidence of their influence versus democracy in more important positions?
Yeah, just quickly, I saw the headlines about that study. I haven't read the whole thing. That was interesting. And, you know, a lot of people, you know, especially people, East Central Europeans, you know, were critical about that, you know, the immediate reaction. Yeah, this is unfair. And, you know, of course it is, there should be, you know, more or less equitable representation. But to be honest, I kind of, when I read that headline, I breathed a slight sigh of relief. Just in the sense that means, well, maybe that is limiting the extent to which, you know, Orban and Kaczynski can put their moles in the institutions. I mean, the way I think about this process is when there's this book by, David Bateman, Katz Nelson, John Lipinski on Southern Nation, you know, talking about when the US had authoritarian enclaves for a century in the US South, you know, that didn't just involve all the horrific things they were doing in their southern states. It also involved them, you know, taking power in Congress and in the federal government by, you know, putting their people in positions of authority. And I think about the EU through that lens because it is happening to some extent. And to answer his question, you know, are there examples of these people getting positions of authority? Well, I'll just give you the top one, right? EU Enlargement Policy, right? The Commissioner for Enlargement is a complete minion of Orban's. So that's the policy that's supposed to be promoting rule of law and democracy and EU values in the, you know, potential accession states. Well, give me a break, right? That has zero credibility when it's Orban's guy in charge. But there are other examples in terms of vice chairs of different committees. I mean, the equivalent of the whip, right? This is actually the guy who got in trouble for attending that you know, orgy, sex party, whatever, and climbing down the, you know, the drain pipe. You might have heard of it. So that Fidesz guy, he had been the chief whip of the EPP party, right, until like a year ago, right? So that's pretty high, you know, high positions, I would say.
Catherine.
Yeah, so this is also a little bit about, you know, like what also was said with Sarah before about, to Amy's question about immigration. I think a very valid point that Sarah's making about, like, what's the moral underpinning of our policy and so on. You know, the fact that the response was a commissioner for protecting our European way of life, which, you know, we know what that means. And it was very much this kind of element. And I think this comes back to also what Dan was saying, that one of the big problems of how we have political power in the European Union is the EPP. And as the EPP, this is their policy. I mean, this is what conservatives, so we can say that, you know, sorry also for, you know, I know Stephanie's German, but, you know, for what the Germans are doing in the sense of like being the moral high ground of Merkel, but the CDU is part of the EPP and has been carrying forward this kind of policy. So the problem also is how you think about that, right? So we deal with this technocracy that I talked about, but then if you would think about it with democracy, well, you know, the majority of Dutch people will re-elect Mark Rutte, who's willing to support EPP very much. He probably, you know, would fit there better than he fits in Renew in some ways. So, you know, this is also the majority of European countries are ruled by center right to really conservative right governments. So it's also a bit of what you know, like what you vote is what you get, right?
So kind of related to this question of enabling, to use, I think Dan used that earlier. Frédéric Meron has a thought experiment for all of you, which is if the EU had shoved a strong rule of law clause down the throat of Hungary and Poland, what would have likely happened? This would be as part of the recovery plan. Matthias, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, there's an interesting background to this, of course, right? At the time that the rule of law crisis came to a head, the Brexit negotiations were reaching a peak as well. And as far as I understand it, if I can trust the people I talk to who say they're very close to Macron and Merkel, there was some sort of deal that Merkel had accepted Macron's hardball tactics with the Brits and was willing to go no deal if that's what Macron wanted. In return, Macron would accept Merkel's sort of approach of trying to keep Hungary and Poland in the fold with the recovery fund. Macron seems more comfortable with a smaller EU. He's very happy with Brexit. I think he would be very happy actually if Hungary and Poland decided to leave. For Germany, it's very different, right? Because Poland and Hungary are a full part of their sort of overall industrial complex. There's a lot of investment there. There's a lot at stake. And so that's, I think, where we kind of ended up with this equilibrium. But I think what would have happened is Europe would have moved forward in some kind of intergovernmental treaty, right? I mean, the right historical case here is probably 2011, if you remember Cameron's big victory at home, where he walked back and vetoed the fiscal compact, and so did the Czech Republic at the time. And then, of course, they made this an intergovernmental treaty. It would have been messy, it would have been slower, and of course, the Italians and the Spanish especially wanted to move much faster. But I think it would have happened, and I'm not convinced that it wouldn't have been better in the longer term because the rule of law issue would have been addressed, even though it may not have been addressed in the budget overall. For next generation EU, they could have excluded Hungary and Poland, at least temporarily.
Dan, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, people who are interested in more detail, I wrote an article like a couple of weeks before the deal was reached in Politico called "Time to Call Hungary and Poland's Bluff," and they can see my take there. But basically, I think to answer directly Frederick's question, I think they could have passed a much tougher version of the rule of law conditionality regulation with no problem, and they wouldn't have even had to go to what Matthias is saying, this intergovernmental version. And the reason is simple. Really, the rule of law conditionality regulation only needed to be passed by QMV, right? That's the decision rule for that. But the German presidency chose to group it together with the decision on the recovery fund and the MFF. It didn't need to do that. In its 6 months of presidency, at any time, it could have passed it. There was a qualified majority for it, right? They could have passed it over the vetoes of Hungary and Poland. And then that being done, they could have turned to the MFF. And I always thought, well, once it was a fait accompli and passed, Hungary and Poland wouldn't have really vetoed the fund because they need the money, right? I mean, maybe they would, but I don't think so. But instead, it was really the German presidency that decided to link them because they wanted, to keep the peace or whatever. Of course, in the end, Hungary and Poland still, voted against the rule of law mechanism, even though it had been, weakened.
Great, thank you, Dan. All right, so another question, which I'll turn to Catherine first, and then whoever wants to jump in, which is it possible for the EU or its member states to tackle Euroscepticism and thereby undercutting the rising autocracies through the recovery fund? And if so, how is it possible during the limited time which already constrains Italy and Spain to use the fund to its full extent?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, it kind of boils down to what we think are the roots of Euroscepticism, right? So the extent to which this is an economic grievancy-based kind of argument, which in many cases, especially in Italy, I think it's very much the case. But I also think that there are other aspects of Euroscepticism which we saw very much in the British debate, which I think the other country that I also see that very much is the Dutch debate, where it's like, hey, this current status quo is actually worse than what we are, and look, we are doing so well, and actually the EU is an anchor dragging us down, and we want to have control. And I think this idea of how Eurosceptic parties, because I think that's very much cueing Euroscepticism, is they have a very particular interpretation of sovereignty. It's not the Mario Draghi famous speech interpretation of sovereignty. It's not, we're interconnected, that's a fact, and therefore we have to find ways in which we can shape that interdependence in the best way. No, it's the Brexiteer interpretation of sovereignty. EU membership is incompatible with sovereignty, right? It's a very kind of Hobbesian absolutist idea of a sovereign state and parliament. So I think then the recovery fund is very difficult if that's the kind of Euroscepticism and kind of political or maybe identity-based kind of interpretation that you have associated with that. That is very difficult to tackle that. I think, not wanting to repeat one of our distinguished colleagues, Eric Jones, I share Eric's concerns about the recovery fund, which is on the basis that I already said about the absorption of how fast Italy and Spain could actually move around the money, is in the fact that this will be used as ammunition by Eurosceptics in the North to say that this will never work, right? That this will not be a way. And look, we tried, we gave it. Of course, they didn't fully try, because if you really understand the EU, you wouldn't have that timeline of the recovery fund, right? If you really understand the bureaucracies, how the problems that they face in the South. But, so I think it's a very, very tricky question. And the ultimate element it could have some positive effect in some countries, but it could actually turn some others against the EU for the reasons I've outlined.
Great, thank you, Catherine. So we're nearing the end of our time. Of course, we could continue this conversation all afternoon or evening, as it were. But to wrap up, I think we have one question, which I think is not something that I asked our panelists to think about, but I think is something that perhaps they're thinking about anyway, which is of course on the mind of those of us in the US, which is, will the new administration in Washington help the EU with these different crises? So it'd be nice to perhaps do a tour of everyone and give your thoughts as formed or unformed as they are on this at this point to conclude our discussion. So would anyone like to jump in first, or I will? Matthias, I will have you start.
All right. I think the short answer is, I hate to say it, but it's no, right? The priorities 1, 2, and 3 for Biden are fighting the pandemic, and then every other priority. I think he let Tony Blinken fix the alliances and kind of talk the good talk. There's not going to be any big trade deals or any big security deals. I think Biden's instinct is to kind of, on foreign policy at least, to turn back to the status quo and probably be even tougher on China and Russia, where I can see quite a bit of transatlantic discord, right? I would be more worried that the discord is going to be bigger between, and Dan has mentioned this as well in previous writing and then on Twitter and so on, but between the UK and the EU, because you now have a kind of, I hate to say it, a very nasty Tory government and its approach towards the EU. The latest from yesterday, giving incentives of EU incentives, £2,000 each to leave the UK to go back to Europe. These kinds of things, I think you're going to end up having Joe Biden, the good Irish American, mediate between Great Britain or United Kingdom or the former United Kingdom of England and Wales. Who knows how fast that goes, and the rest of the EU. So there, I think Biden will play the role, but not in helping Europe solve its crises.
Thank you, Matthias. Stephanie.
Well, even if we won't fix many of the crises, the transatlantic tensions I talked about, I think this will be subsumed. Biden already called Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, and said, repeated the phone call you can see on Twitter, repeated over and over again how committed he has always been to the transatlantic alliance. And I think so, at least rhetorically, that will ease the tensions, but I'm not sure, as Matthias already said too, whether that actually would have big implications as to what's going on both on the US side and the European side. Merkel, I think just recently in Davos, a couple of days ago, said that she doesn't want to be part of blocs, right? So she doesn't want to be pushed into the US bloc against China. And I think that issue, given that NATO is now, for example, also more and more discussing China, will be an issue of contention that will keep on creating tensions between the US and Europe, but with a different style attached to it that doesn't resemble Trump's style.
Great, thank you. Sara.
Yeah, just quickly, I'm thinking through the implications, and I think one of the consequences of kind of nationalizing immigration politics, with the exception of security, is that when the morality frame is security, it insulates from international intervention, but with the exception of if it were a sort of humanitarian crisis. So I can't imagine Biden stepping in. Although I will say that, per Stephanie's comment, I think that a more fleshed out State Department is going to make a big difference, just in general. I do remember the first impeachment. I remember thinking, how come we're not talking more about the fact that the ambassador to the EU is in Ukraine? Where's everyone else being, where's the staff there? So I think that just feeling the State Department more generally will have a stronger US presence in European politics more generally.
Great, thank you. Dan.
Hi. Well, we're all glad, I think, that the wannabe authoritarian Trump, is gone. And certainly he was very hostile to the EU and tried where he, didn't really succeed, but tried to kind of play a divide and conquer game and do everything he could to undermine the EU and to promote the anti-democratic forces within the EU. That's all true. So in that respect, good, he's gone for the EU. But on the other hand, you can say, often a common enemy is what drives a union together, right? And so Trump was, in a sense, for many, that kind of hostile force from the outside. Biden, of course, and the Biden administration will promote European integration. They'll say they support the EU and support European cooperation. They will push back against anti-democratic forces within the EU. But I don't think, that'll be decisive, ultimately for the sort of direction of integration or for the resolution. Ultimately, it's going to be up to, Europeans, and the influence of the US is just limited, I think.
Great. Matthias has a two-finger.
Yeah, and just on Dan's point, I think one thing where Biden can be influential is if he does his summit of democracies and invites, for example, Poland, but not Hungary or and not Turkey or something like this. But we'll have to see who gets an invitation and if that summit actually happens.
Yeah, so I think that there has been, so I agree with everything that was said. I do think that in some ways the last years have been good in the sense that for Europe to think about as an emancipation. So I think, free riding on the United States and not thinking about, how we, and it might be many of us are not going to like what comes out of the thinking of the EU. That's a different story, but just, like thinking about how you deal with, for example, security, how you try to do this in a different way, indeed in a block way, but more in a partnered and equal partner way. And I think that and I think that Biden will be very preoccupied with the United States, and he ought to be, because Trump might be gone, but there's a lot of that sentiment still there, and one has to think about that. But the other thing is, I don't even know on Matthias, but I do think that Biden will have this kind of like role between the UK and the EU, but the EU wants the UK there because the UK is the enemy at the moment, right? You see it in the vaccines, everything. It takes this much, and we're getting back into that element. And then the EU is trying not to do that, but then they do anyway, right? They're trying to kind of be, so I think in some ways, this has really become a quite element within the UK. And then Biden not being a Trump, right, actually helps the EU to isolate the UK and the conservative government in that way. And then this spat, I think it was also used by the EU explicitly to make these points and reference the Trump, this was the same treatment as in Trump times, et cetera, et cetera. So in that way, I think there is, the Trump administration has served a purpose. And I think the Biden administration in being closer to some of the core ideals of the EU serves a purpose for this internal fight that's going on with Brexit at this moment in time.
Well, on that note, thank you all so much for your insights and your comments. This has been a really wonderful discussion. And if you, to the audience members, have not heard enough about Brexit, which of course will continue both by those in the EU and of course those in the UK, as we got a comment related to that. At noon next Thursday, Anand Manan from UK and a Changing Europe will be joining us noon Eastern time. So feel free to join us for that as well in the same Zoom space, I guess. But thank you all again. For those in our audience, we do have a brief survey that we'd like you to fill out, which should just take a couple of minutes, which helps us in future planning. That's in the chat, as well as some information for Pitt students for getting credit for today's event. So those are all in the chat. And thank you all again. And we will hopefully see you all at sometime soon. Take care.